When the producers of Over the Top went looking for a villain to sit across the table from Sylvester Stallone, they found a hog farmer from South Georgia who was so enormous that the entire premise of the film collapsed. Nobody would believe Stallone could beat him, so they hired a smaller man and wrote the real strongest arm wrestler alive out of the story entirely. That man was Luther Cleve Dean, born December 15, 1953, in Pavo, Georgia, a town so small that it barely registers on a map of the state. And the strange, wonderful thing about his story is that the movie people were right. There was no believable way to script a loss for him. For the better part of a decade, there was no believable way to script a loss for anyone. To understand how that happened, you have to start with the farm, because the farm is the whole answer. Dean grew up raising hogs and harvesting cotton and tobacco on his family's land. As a teenager, he was hauling 100-pound bags of feed out to the hog pens, day after day, in Georgia heat, and by the time he was 21, he already weighed 325 pounds. Not gym weight, not sculpted magazine, Venice Beach weight, farm weight, the kind that comes from a body being asked to do heavy things every single day since childhood and simply obliging. There is a story, repeated in the press of the day and later in the Los Angeles Times in 1985, that sometimes, for fun, Dean would pick up the rear end of the family's 7-ton John Deere. Now that one deserves a small caveat, because it is exactly the kind of detail that grows in the retelling, and lifting the back of a tractor is a stunt that depends enormously on where you grab it and how the weight distributes. But it was reported often enough, and by enough different outlets, that something like it clearly happened in front of witnesses. The same goes for the line that turned up again and again in newspapers, that he could carry a full-grown hog under each arm. Dean himself never made it sound mystical. Speaking to People magazine in 1980, he explained that his strength came straight off his father's hog farm and put it about as plainly as it can be put. When you farm like they farmed, he said, you use all your muscles. That is the first of the two things this story is really about. Cleve Dean was not built by a training program. He was built by work. Here's where it turns, though, and where the story stops being a charming tale about a strong country boy. At 22, working on the farm, Dean suffered a severe back injury that crushed and fused his 4th and 5th lumbar vertebrae. It wrecked his mobility. He had been big and athletic enough that he had spent time at a Miami Dolphins training camp, and that door closed permanently. His weight, no longer being burned off by relentless labor, climbed toward 400 pounds and kept going. So the injury that ended one athletic life handed him another one. Arm wrestling is a sport you can compete in while sitting down. That is not a small detail. It is arguably the reason the sport got him at all. He entered his first tournament in December 1977 and lost in the final. That is the only genuinely ordinary result in the entire arc of his career, and it lasted less than a year. In October 1978, he turned up at the World's Wristwrestling Championship in Petaluma, California, which at the time was the most famous arm wrestling event on the planet, the one that had been on television, the one that carried the title everybody actually wanted. He won the heavyweight division without losing a match. And then he did something that tells you more about his personality than any measurement ever could. He decided the win did not count. Some of the biggest names in the sport had skipped Petaluma that year, and Dean knew it. So rather than sit on a world title with an asterisk hanging off it, he contacted the promoter, Tony Celeste, who was in the middle of building Arm Wrestling International into the sport's premier professional outfit, and made an open offer. $2,500 of his own money against anyone on earth who wanted it, 2 out of 3 falls, in $1978, put up by the competitors themselves. There was only one obvious taker, Virgil Arciero, 6'5", 245 pounds, out of California, had not lost a match in nearly 3 years, and held world titles across essentially every major organization of the 1970s. Arciero was, by consensus, the man to beat. The match happened on November 15, 1978, at the Silver Slipper Casino in Las Vegas. Dean weighed 480 pounds. There's a wonderful story from the build-up where Arciero, who had never actually seen Dean compete, and was understandably curious about what he was walking into, asked around among Dean's backers whether any of them had watched him pull. One of them apparently said no, but he had seen old Cleve move a Cadillac pretty easily. Arciero lost 2 straight. By his own account, he could not find a weak point anywhere in Dean's hand to attack, which for a technician of that caliber is close to an admission that the problem was unsolvable. That was the moment the sport changed hands. From that night in November 1978 through to the middle of the 1980s, Cleve Dean was the favorite to win every single tournament he entered anywhere in the world, and the historical record on the professional arm wrestling side backs it up in a way that very few dominance claims do. Between 1980 and 1986, he collected at least 20 national or world titles, drawn from every significant organization of the era: the AAA, AWI, IWC, WPAA, WPWA, and the WWC. Career totals vary depending on who is counting and what they are counting, which is normal for a sport with this many competing sanctioning bodies. Some sources say more than 60 titles, others put the number closer to 90. Pick whichever figure you find credible. The shape of it does not change, and the sport actively made it easier for him. When Petaluma added a left-hand division in 1984, Dean, who pulled more or less equally well with either arm, simply started collecting 2 world titles a year instead of 1. Being ambidextrous at that level is rare enough on its own. Being ambidextrous while also being the strongest man at the table is faintly ridiculous. The physical details are where it stops feeling like sport and starts feeling like folklore. Reports on his height vary between 6'6" and 6'7", which happens with big men in imprecise reporting. His competition weight is listed anywhere from 300 and something in his leanest years up to 480. His hand measured somewhere between 8.5 and 10 inches from palm to the tip of the middle finger, and roughly 6 inches across. He wore a size 20 ring. One local writer in Georgia summed up the scale better than any measurement, noting that Dean's hand could completely eclipse a beer can, which, when you think about the mechanics of arm wrestling, explains almost everything. The sport is decided at the hand: grip, wrist, fingers. Dean's opponents were not just out-muscled, they were being enveloped. There is one story from 1983 that I want to flag carefully because I could not find it verified anywhere I would call solid, and it has the smell of a promoter's press release. The claim is that at a promotional event that year, Dean took on roughly 500 men off the street, one after another, and not a single one of them lasted a full second. Treat the number as marketing, if you like. But the interesting thing is that nobody who was actually around the sport at the time seems to have thought the claim was outrageous. That tells you something about the level of respect involved. Which brings us back to the movie. By the mid-1980s, arm wrestling was having a genuine cultural moment in America, and Hollywood noticed. Over the Top went into production, with Stallone playing a truck driver who arm wrestles his way to redemption, and the film needed a final boss. Cleve Dean was considered for the role of Bull Hurley. Of course he was. He was the actual answer to the question the movie was asking, and then somebody in the production did the math. Stallone, on screen, was going to have to beat this man. Stallone weighed a fraction of what Dean weighed. The audience would not buy it for a second, not even inside the generous physics of an 80s sports movie, and the whole climax would land as comedy. So the role went to Rick Zumwalt instead, a legitimate California puller who had been active from the mid-70s through the mid-80s, with 7 state titles and a genuine competitive resume of his own. Zumwalt was a real arm wrestler. He was also merely enormous rather than incomprehensible, and that made him castable. Sit with that for a moment. Cleve Dean was too strong to play an arm wrestler in a movie about arm wrestling. That is the single strangest compliment ever paid to an athlete in any sport, and it is the reason his name has survived. Millions of people who have never heard of Cleve Dean have watched Bull Hurley lose to Sylvester Stallone. That character exists in that form because of a hog farmer in Pavo. Now, the temptation with a story like this is to leave it there, at the peak, with the movie anecdote and the undefeated stretch. But the honest version has one more chapter, and it is the more human one. The most instructive single day of his career came on July 15th, 1984, at the Marriott Hotel in Bloomington, Minnesota, at the World Super Heavyweight Arm Wrestling Championship. Dean was there. So was a young Scott Norton, years before he became better known as a professional wrestler. So was Johnny Walker, the Georgia middleweight nicknamed the Iceman, who had ruled his own division since the end of the 70s. And so was John Brzenk, who happened to be turning 20 that very day, and who would eventually become the most decorated arm wrestler in history. Dean beat Norton in a long, brutal match that finally ended on fouls for repeated grip releases. He also put Johnny Walker into the losers bracket. Norton, who by every account had never fully recovered from that marathon against Dean, was eliminated afterward and finished fourth. The future of the entire sport was sitting in that room, and Cleve Dean spent the afternoon running through it. He was 30 years old and the world had no answer for him, and his body was already sending the bill. This is where the story crosses out of the era it belongs to, so it is worth being precise about the timeline. The dominance we have been describing runs from the Silver Slipper in November 1978 to roughly 1986, when failing health pulled him away from serious competition. Everything after that is a different chapter of his life, and it should not be confused with the peak. By the early 90s, he had left professional arm wrestling. His weight climbed past 600 pounds. He was classified 100% disabled, living with constant back pain that traced back to those fused vertebrae from the farm accident nearly 20 years earlier. He told an interviewer that he had spent that period genuinely afraid he would have a heart attack. The body that made him a legend was, by then, mostly a problem to be managed. What he did next is the part I find most affecting. He trained his way back down. Not with anything glamorous. Isometrics, a stationary bike, and hours of walking through chest-deep water, because water was the only place his frame could carry itself without punishing him for it. He came back to competition in 1993, a decision he later described himself as premature, and he was honest about the fact that the man who returned was not the man who left. By 1996, his chest had gone from 72 inches down to 64, and he was still chasing the 300-pound version of himself that had existed in another decade. He was not finished, though. At the 1994 Yukon Jack World Championships, in an era of the sport that had moved on well past his prime, Cleve Dean won his first Yukon Jack World title, with a memorable win over Gary Goodridge, who would shortly afterward go on to a long and violent career in mixed martial arts. That title mattered because by the mid-90s, the Yukon Jack year-end event had become the hardest tournament in the world to win, harder than the AAA Nationals, harder than Petaluma itself. 16 years after the Silver Slipper, at a body weight he was actively fighting, he was still winning world titles. That is a footnote in his career. For anyone else, it would be the whole career. He competed sporadically into the mid-2000s, slowed further by a hip replacement, and eventually stepped away for good. In his last years, he ran a mobile home business back in Georgia, spoke openly about having given his life to God, and seemed largely at peace with what he had been. In one of his final interviews with the Valdosta Daily Times in 2011, the thing he chose to emphasize was not the titles or the records. It was the people. He figured he had met more of them than just about anybody around. He died on May 10th, 2011, reportedly of a heart attack, near Stockbridge, Georgia. He was 57 years old. The local papers called him by the name the sport had given him decades earlier, the Armbreaker. So was he the strongest arm wrestler who ever lived? The honest answer is that arm wrestling has never produced a clean way to measure that, and the modern era has men doing things at the table that would have been unthinkable in 1980. But there is a specific kind of dominance that only shows up once. Dean did not just beat the best pullers of his generation. He beat them so thoroughly that promoters had to build events around the question of who could survive him longest, and a Hollywood studio had to remove him from a film for making its script impossible. And none of it came from a gym. It came from feed sacks and hogs and cotton rows and a tractor in a field in Pavo, Georgia, from a young man who got strong by accident and then found out, at 22, with a broken back, that the accident was all he had left. The next time Bull Hurley slams his fist on that table in Over the Top, Remember that the character is a compromise. The real thing was sitting on a farm in South Georgia, and he was better than the movies were allowed to show.